We are witnessing a moment of immense danger unfolding in real time, a geopolitical storm that carries consequences far beyond what most Americans can grasp. Venezuela, a nation resting atop the planet's largest confirmed oil reserves, has become the newest flashpoint in a global power struggle that could edge the world closer to catastrophe. What's taking shape there is not simply the story of one nation's internal political drama. It's the continuation of a pattern we've seen replayed from Iraq to Libya, from Syria to countless other nations caught between idealism and imperial ambition. For years, Washington has imposed suffocating sanctions on Venezuela, measures sold to the public as tools of democratic pressure, but which have crippled the economy and inflicted unimaginable hardship on ordinary citizens. Food scarcity, medical shortages, hyperinflation, and mass migration are the visible scars of policies framed as humanitarian. Behind the rhetoric of freedom lies an undeniable truth. These are not instruments of compassion, but of control. As with every other nation subjected to such tactics, the price has been paid not by the powerful, but by the powerless. Openly, American officials speak of restoring democracy and protecting human rights, yet the underlying motives are neither hidden nor novel. We hear once again the familiar talk of regime change, the hints of intervention, the strategic calculations tied to natural resources. The pattern is painfully clear: destabilize, delegitimize, then dominate. The question Americans must begin to ask is not whether Venezuela's government is flawed, but whether our foreign policy itself has become the engine of chaos it claims to oppose. Are we exporting stability or manufacturing disorder? Are we defenders of democracy or enforcers of dominance? Because history speaks louder than slogans. Each time we've intervened under the banner of liberty, we have left behind a trail of ruin. Iraq still bleeds from the fractures we created. Libya remains in pieces. Syria suffers from endless proxy conflict. And now Venezuela stands on the edge of becoming the next casualty of the same relentless pattern, a nation punished for refusing to bend. Venezuela's crisis did not erupt in isolation. It was born out of decades of political tension, economic inequality, and external interference. Yet it also represents something much larger, a test of whether the United States will continue to assert its will through coercion, or whether it will finally choose diplomacy, sovereignty, and mutual respect. Our strength as a nation should never depend on another's submission. True security cannot be built on sanctions and threats, but on principles and partnerships that honor international law. This moment, more than any before, demands introspection. For Venezuela is not simply a battleground of ideology. It is a mirror held up to our own foreign policy legacy. How we act now will reveal whether we've learned from the wreckage of past interventions or whether we remain trapped in the same self-destructive cycle of power pursued at any cost. To understand how Venezuela reached this breaking point, we must look back at the moment its political landscape began to shift, when a former army officer named Hugo Chavez rose from obscurity to the presidency in 1998. His election was no accident of history. It was the culmination of decades of social inequality, corruption, and resentment. For generations, Venezuela's vast oil wealth had enriched a narrow elite. While the majority of citizens struggled to survive, the profits of the world's most valuable resource flowed outward to private oligarchs and foreign corporations. While millions of Venezuelans were left behind in poverty, Chavez entered that vacuum like a storm. He spoke a language the poor understood, one of dignity, justice, and ownership of their nation's destiny. His platform was simple yet revolutionary: claim Venezuela's oil wealth for its people, build social programs for health and education, and end the dominance of the traditional ruling class. To his supporters, he embodied hope. To his critics, he was a populist demagogue. But above all, Chavez represented something Washington found intolerable: independence. His government began nationalizing industries, forging closer ties with Latin American neighbors, and challenging American dominance across the region. He denounced the era of foreign exploitation and dared to question the legitimacy of U.S. power in Latin America. Whether one admired him or despised him, Chavez was unapologetically sovereign, and that was enough to make him an enemy in the eyes of the United States. For over a century, American policy toward Latin America had followed a familiar doctrine: support governments that cooperate, undermine those that resist. From Guatemala to Chile, from Nicaragua to Argentina, the pattern remained constant. Democratically elected leaders who defied Washington's economic or strategic interests were branded threats, destabilized, and replaced, often through coups or covert operations. These are not conspiracy theories. They are verifiable facts, documented by declassified files and official admissions. The CIA's role in the 1954 Guatemalan coup is public record. Our support for Pinochet's dictatorship in Chile is undisputed. Across the continent, countless lives were lost under regimes backed by U.S. power in the name of freedom. So when Chavez began asserting Venezuela's sovereignty, the response from Washington was swift and predictable. A leader who redirected oil profits toward the poor, who criticized American militarism, and who built alliances with Cuba and Russia, was branded a destabilizing force. The U.S. media amplified this narrative, portraying Venezuela as a dictatorship in the making, rather than a nation attempting to redefine its economic independence. Then came April 2002, the moment of reckoning. A coup attempt briefly removed Chavez from power, and within hours, the United States welcomed the new leadership as if democracy had been restored. But the Venezuelan people, millions of them, flooded the streets, demanding their president's return. Within 2 days, the coup collapsed, and Chavez was reinstated. Later investigations revealed U.S. funding for opposition groups, early coordination with coup plotters, and hasty recognition of the short-lived interim government. That event marked a permanent rupture in U.S.-Venezuelan relations. It showed Venezuelans and much of the world that the American commitment to democracy was conditional, dependent not on popular will, but on political alignment. From that moment on, Washington's strategy shifted. If Chavez could not be removed by force, he would be weakened by isolation, delegitimized by propaganda, and strangled by economic pressure. And thus began the long, slow campaign to break Venezuela's resistance, a campaign that would outlast Chavez himself and define an entire generation of foreign policy failure. The coup of 2002 failed to unseat Hugo Chavez, so Washington recalibrated. The playbook changed from open confrontation to a more insidious form of warfare, one that didn't require troops, only financial power. What followed was an intensifying campaign of economic pressure designed to erode Venezuela's stability from within, while maintaining the illusion of diplomacy. Sanctions were introduced as the peaceful alternative to war, the civilized way to punish governments without bloodshed. But modern sanctions are not benign. They are precision weapons that target the lifelines of an economy. They freeze industries, freeze assets, block access to global banking, and intimidate other nations from engaging in trade. The effect is the same as bombing infrastructure, only slower and easier to deny. By the mid-2010s, sanctions against Venezuela had become some of the most comprehensive and destructive in modern history. The United States didn't just restrict government officials or arms sales. It went after the country's oil sector, the source of 95% of its export earnings. It cut Venezuela off from international financial systems, seized billions in overseas reserves, and threatened secondary sanctions against anyone who dared to do business with Caracas. It was economic suffocation disguised as moral action. The results were devastating. The Venezuelan economy imploded, contracting by more than 3/4 since 2013. Hyperinflation reduced savings to dust. Shelves emptied, hospitals ran out of medicine, and once thriving cities descended into desperation. The human toll became unbearable. Treatable diseases turned deadly. Malnutrition soared. Millions fled across borders seeking survival. It became one of the largest displacement crises in the Western Hemisphere. And yet in Washington, the suffering was recast as proof of the Venezuelan government's failure. The cruel irony was that the very conditions created by U.S. sanctions were used to justify even harsher measures. Officials pointed to shortages, unemployment, and collapsing institutions as evidence of mismanagement under Nicolas Maduro, Chavez's successor, while omitting that the economy was being deliberately strangled by design. The sanctions did not just punish the state, they punished every family that depended on its economy. Independent analysts began sounding alarms. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Unilateral Coercive Measures warned that U.S. sanctions might constitute crimes against humanity. Researchers at the Center for Economic and Policy Research found tens of thousands of Venezuelan deaths linked to restricted access to food and medicine. Even American economists acknowledged the catastrophic humanitarian impact. But inside the political establishment, there was silence, bipartisan silence. Democrats and Republicans alike defend it. The policy is tough love, as though crushing a nation's economy could somehow teach it democracy. This is the hypocrisy at the heart of American foreign policy. We claim to oppose tyranny while employing methods that cause mass suffering. We call sanctions nonviolent, yet they destroy lives just as surely as bombs do, only without the images of war to hold us accountable. The architects of this policy understand perfectly what they are doing. Economic collapse isn't collateral damage. It's the objective. It's how regime change is achieved without the political cost of invasion. Starve a country, destabilize its institutions, and then point to the chaos as proof of the government's incompetence. It's a strategy that turns human misery into propaganda. By the late 2010s, Venezuela was trapped in this cycle. Every attempt at recovery was sabotaged by new restrictions. Every sign of resilience punished with further isolation. The world's largest oil reserves had become a curse, not because of misfortune, but because they were coveted by the same powers now claiming to save the Venezuelan people. Behind every policy statement and press briefing about restoring democracy in Venezuela lies a much darker reality, a reality written in hunger, sickness, and loss. Sanctions, which Washington markets as a humane alternative to war, have become a silent weapon that kills slowly, invisibly, and without accountability. They do not discriminate between government officials and ordinary citizens. They collapse hospitals, empty shelves, and break supply chains. They turn daily survival into an act of resistance. In Venezuela, this slow-motion disaster has hollowed out a once thriving society. Inflation has obliterated wages. Medical imports have dried up, leaving even basic treatments out of reach. Electricity and clean water have become inconsistent luxuries for millions. Families skip meals so their children can eat. Hospitals reuse disposable equipment because replacements cannot be purchased. Parents watch their loved ones die from illnesses that were once easily treatable. Sanctions are not a policy debate. They are a sentence handed down without trial. And yet the architects of this suffering continue to cloak their actions in the language of human rights. American officials declare that sanctions are necessary to defend democracy and pressure a corrupt regime. But the record of our foreign policy exposes this rhetoric as hollow. If democracy were truly the standard by which we judged other nations, Saudi Arabia would be under sanctions, not partnership. Egypt's military dictatorship would not receive billions in U.S. aid. The United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Jordan, all authoritarian states, would not enjoy lucrative arms deals and diplomatic immunity. The difference is not democracy, it's obedience. Nations that serve American interests are excused for their repression. Those that defy them are condemned and punished. Venezuela's greatest crime in Washington's eyes is not corruption or incompetence, it's independence. The moral contradiction is glaring. We punish one government under the pretense of freedom while arming others that crush dissent, imprison journalists, and execute opponents. We cite human rights in Venezuela while ignoring massacres in Yemen, carried out with US-supplied weapons. We claim to care about humanitarian suffering even as our policies multiply it. This is not foreign policy guided by principle. It is imperial power wrapped in moral theater. What makes this deception even more unbearable is its transparency. Former US officials have said openly what many only whisper. This is about oil. John Bolton himself stated that American companies should have access to Venezuela's oil fields, that regime change would serve US interests. There was no pretense of altruism, no talk of humanitarian duty, only the cold calculation of profit and power. Venezuela possesses more proven oil reserves than any other nation on earth. Over 300 billion barrels, a treasure beneath its soil that could transform its future. But to Washington, that wealth is too great to be left under the control of a government that refuses to submit. Were Venezuela a poor nation without resources, no one in the State Department would utter its name. Its people would remain invisible, as millions do in countries whose suffering offers no strategic gain. This is why the official narrative is so dangerous. It conditions the American public to see devastation as benevolence, to mistake exploitation for moral duty. We are told that the suffering of Venezuelans is proof of socialism's failure, when in truth it is evidence of a siege. We are told sanctions are peaceful when they function as economic warfare. We are told this is about democracy when it is about control. And until we face that truth, until we acknowledge the lives destroyed in our pursuit of dominance, we will continue repeating this same cycle, dressing empire in the language of virtue, while entire nations crumble under its weight. At this stage of the story, the defenders of American policy always raise the same question. What about Nicolas Maduro? Isn't he corrupt? Isn't he repressive? Isn't the suffering of his people his fault? These questions sound reasonable on the surface, but they distract from the deeper issue. The point is not whether the Venezuelan government is perfect. It isn't. The question is whether the United States has either the right or the wisdom to decide another nation's leadership through economic strangulation or the threat of invasion. History gives a clear and painful answer. Every time we have pursued regime change under the banner of liberation, the result has been destruction, not democracy. In Iraq, we toppled a dictator and unleashed a civil war that fractured a nation and birthed one of the most violent extremist movements in modern history. Hundreds of thousands died. Millions were displaced. Decades later, Iraq still struggles to rebuild its sovereignty from the ashes of our intervention. In Libya, we repeated the pattern. The removal of Muammar Gaddafi was sold as a humanitarian mission to prevent atrocities. What followed was the total collapse of the Libyan state. Rival militias, open slave markets, and a continuing war transformed North Africa into a corridor of chaos. NATO called it a success. The Libyan people called it ruin. Afghanistan was supposed to be different. The good war fought to bring democracy and women's rights. Yet after 20 years, $2 trillion, and countless lives lost, the moment American troops withdrew, the government we built collapsed overnight. The Taliban returned to power, and our promises dissolved into dust. This is the legacy of American interventionism, destruction disguised as deliverance. Every attempt to rebuild another nation in our image ends up proving how little we understand the societies we try to control. We reduce complex nations to caricatures, good versus evil, democracy versus dictatorship, and then act shocked when reality refuses to fit our narrative. Venezuela is the next test of whether we can finally learn from these failures. Because the truth is, our obsession with control has not made the world safer. It has made it more unstable. Every intervention creates new enemies. Every regime change plants the seeds of future conflict. We call it spreading democracy, but what we're spreading is distrust, resentment, and the erosion of international law. Maduro's government is far from blameless. There are legitimate concerns about corruption, mismanagement, and political repression. But even if every accusation were true, it would not justify a foreign power deciding the fate of a sovereign people. The United States does not have the moral authority to destroy economies, recognize unelected leaders, or wage proxy wars simply because it dislikes another government's politics. If we truly cared about democracy, we would respect the democratic process, not override it when it produces results we don't like. The evidence shows clearly that intervention has not improved life for Venezuelans. On the contrary, it has deepened their suffering. Sanctions have strengthened the very government they were meant to weaken by allowing Maduro to rally nationalist sentiment against foreign aggression. The opposition, once hopeful, has fractured under the weight of Washington's involvement. The people caught between internal dysfunction and external hostility bear the burden of both. There comes a point when we must ask, who benefits from this endless cycle of intervention and collapse? It isn't the citizens of the targeted countries. It isn't the American people who inherit the cost and debt, instability, and lost credibility. The beneficiaries are the same as always: the corporations, the arms manufacturers, the political elites who profit from chaos. We have to confront an uncomfortable truth: the ideology of American exceptionalism, the belief that we have a divine right to reshape the world, is not a virtue. It's a danger. It blinds us to our failures, justifies our violence, and perpetuates an empire that cannot admit its mistakes. Venezuela's crisis exposes this delusion in stark relief. We cannot bomb or sanction our way to legitimacy. We cannot preach freedom while denying sovereignty. The real test of leadership is not whether we can impose our will on others, but whether we can restrain ourselves from repeating the very actions that history has already condemned. Venezuela is a mirror, and what it reflects back is our own inability to learn. The pattern of intervention and domination that once defined U.S. foreign policy was built on a myth: the idea that America was uniquely ordained to guide the world, that our values were universal, and that our power was inherently righteous. For decades, that narrative shaped the post-war order. We called it American exceptionalism. But as global power shifts and new nations rise, that illusion is breaking. The world no longer accepts Washington's self-appointed authority, and Venezuela is one of the clearest demonstrations of that awakening. We now live in an age of multipolar reality. China's economy rivals America's in scale and influence. Russia remains a formidable military force. India, Brazil, Indonesia, and others are asserting their sovereignty with growing confidence. These nations reject the notion that global rules should be written in one capital alone. Yet instead of adapting to this new balance, Washington clings to the habits of empire, punishing defiance with sanctions, isolating competitors, and declaring moral superiority, even as its actions undermine the very order it claims to defend. When the United States unilaterally declares which governments are legitimate, as it did by recognizing Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president, it isn't upholding democracy. It's violating the core principle of international law: sovereignty. Juan Guaidó was never elected to lead his country. He was appointed by foreign powers who preferred him politically. Nations across Asia, Africa, and even Europe hesitated to follow Washington's lead because they understood what was at stake. Recognizing a government that doesn't actually govern is an assault on the foundation of statehood itself. The irony is that by trying to preserve dominance, we are eroding the very framework that kept the world relatively stable since World War II. The so-called rules-based international order only functions when power respects law. When the strongest nation decides that the rules don't apply to itself, others begin to do the same. If America can impose economic warfare and declare presidents by fiat, why shouldn't other major powers claim the same right? We are setting precedents that weaken our own credibility. Every unilateral sanction, every act of coercion, chips away at the moral authority the United States once claimed. Instead of being seen as a beacon of democracy, we are increasingly viewed as an enforcer of convenience, a power that invokes human rights selectively and bends international law to serve economic interests. That perception has consequences far beyond Venezuela. It fuels resentment among allies, distrust among neutral states, and solidarity among rivals. China and Russia have seized this moment to expand their influence by offering an alternative to nations targeted by American pressure. Beijing invests where Washington imposes sanctions. Moscow provides military support where the U.S. threatens intervention. For Venezuela, this realignment has become a lifeline. But for the global balance of power, it represents a seismic shift. America's strategy of isolation has backfired, accelerating the very multipolar world it fears most. The decline of unquestioned U.S. dominance is not necessarily a tragedy. It can be an opportunity, a chance to move from empire to partnership, from control to cooperation. But that transformation requires humility, a virtue Washington rarely shows. Instead of recognizing limits, our leaders double down on confrontation. They see every challenge as defiance, every assertion of independence as hostility. This reflex has not preserved American strength. It has exhausted it. If we continue down this path, the outcome is predictable. The erosion of our alliances, the strengthening of our adversaries, and the loss of moral legitimacy on the world stage. True leadership in a multipolar world will not come from intimidation. It will come from example, from showing that power can coexist with restraint, that democracy can be defended without domination, and that respect for sovereignty is not a weakness, but the foundation of peace. Venezuela is not the beginning of this transformation, nor will it be the end. It is a warning that the age of unchecked American primacy is closing, and that what replaces it will depend on whether we can evolve from rulers of the world into genuine partners within it. For nearly 2 centuries, the Monroe Doctrine stood as the invisible hand of U.S. dominance across the Western Hemisphere. Announced in 1823 under the guise of protecting Latin America from European colonialism, it gradually evolved into a license for American interventionism, a doctrine not of protection, but possession. The United States proclaimed the Americas its backyard, and from that moment onward, every movement for independence south of its borders carried the shadow of Washington's control. But now, at last, that shadow is breaking. Venezuela's defiance did not emerge in a vacuum. It is part of a broader awakening sweeping through Latin America, a region that has endured coups, assassinations, puppet regimes, and decades of economic exploitation, all justified by the pretext of maintaining stability. From Chile to Argentina, from Bolivia to Mexico, nations once subdued by fear are rediscovering the language of sovereignty. They are no longer willing to be laboratories for foreign policy experiments or silent spectators in a global game they never consented to play. The collapse of U.S. influence in the region didn't happen overnight. It began with years of broken promises, free trade deals that enriched elites but impoverished workers, military partnerships that entrenched authoritarianism, and foreign aid that came with political strings attached. Every act of interference bred resistance. Every manipulation of democracy taught Latin Americans to question the sincerity of Washington's words.